We're just going to take a moment. We're just going to take a moment to get everybody woven in before we start our webinar today. If you are a member of the advisory committee for the offshore wind roadmap process here in Maine, or if you're a member of the Maine team members of the Intergovernmental Task Force for BOEM for Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and you are not currently as a panelist here on the webinar, go ahead and send a text to Samanish, my colleague here in the chat. You should be able to chat and she can get you in the right place. And welcome everybody who's joining us as observers today. Let's just take a moment and get all of our participants lined up here. And folks here who are panelists, welcome. You'll notice we've got two groups of folks today with us. We have advisory committee members from the roadmap process, the offshore wind roadmap process, and members of the Maine group who are part of that intergovernmental task force that BOEM convenes with Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. So welcome folks in this combined meeting. Great. Okay. So welcome, folks. I think we're almost ready to get going here. Wonderful. All right. Well, my name is David Plum, and my role here is just to help facilitate this 1-hour meeting. As I mentioned, it's a joint meeting of the advisory committee and members of Maine's members from the Intergovernmental Task Force that BOEM is convening with Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. We're here to get a briefing from BOEM about their commercial leasing process. To kick it off, first, we're going to have some comments from your co-chairs of the advisory committee. And then we also have BOEM here to offer some opening words before a presentation. So why don't I turn it over to Director Dan Burgess with the Governor's Energy Office to start us off today. Dan, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Dan Burgess, Director of the Governor's Energy Office. I want to thank the team from BOEM for joining us virtually today. Looking forward to the overview and discussion. So this is the advisory committee of the roadmap and the main members of the Intergovernmental Regional Task Force. I do want to note we've got several staff members from Maine's federal delegation. We have Senate President Jackson, Representative Grahowski, Representative Helper, and then hopefully I'm not missing any other elected officials, but really appreciate their engagement. And again, thank you to BOEM. The advisory committee, the roadmap process that we've been running is a EDA federally supported initiative that has brought leaders from across the state together through an 18-month process to do immediate and long-term planning around the opportunities for floating offshore wind. And then the Gulf of Maine Task Force members, we've not met as a group for some time, given there has not been a task force meeting to prepare for, but excited to have this opportunity to work with and to hear from BOEM. You know, we see this as the first of several conversations that we're all going to be having about the future of the federal process. And the goal of today is to really just start the reintroduction of BOEM, begin information sharing, ask questions, and really identify future opportunities and needs for shared learning. So I appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate BOEM making the time. And unless Admiral, you have other words, I think we can turn it back to David to get started.
No, I have nothing else to add. Thank you for that introduction and welcome everybody. We appreciate your time and efforts today.
Wonderful. Thank you both. From BOEM, we have several people with us today. I know we have Jim Bennett with us, who's program manager at the Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and a senior leader over there at BOEM. And Jim, why don't I turn it over to you to offer some words of introduction.
Sure. Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Dan and Admiral Johnson. I just want to, aside from saying thank you, I want to welcome everybody. Appreciate everybody's attendance. It's quite an impressive turnout, and appreciate inviting us to provide this information exchange. As you know, we're the federal agency that's responsible for energy development on the outer continental shelf beyond state waters. And we've been at this process for quite a while, since 2005, actually since regulations in 2009, and since leasing began in earnest in 2013. And of course, the explosion of interest that has occurred since 2018, including the Gulf of Maine. And I just want to note that this only works if we work together through our efforts on the Intergovernmental State Task Forces, your advisory committee, and we want to make sure that that happens. And hopefully you'll get some good information from Luke and Zach, and we'll continue to work towards working together so that indeed we do have a successful development of wind energy in the Gulf of Maine. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Okay, so why don't we get going? Our agenda today is to hear from BOEM with a presentation that's going to be about a half hour. And after that presentation, we have the opportunity to offer and clarifying questions, have a conversation. I will turn it over to Luke Feinberg at BOEM, who I think will be leading the presentation. And Luke, with your colleague, Zach, I'll turn it over. You all can share your slides. If you need some help, just let me know.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance today. So again, my name is Luke Feinberg, and I assume you can hear me and see my presentation here. All right, great. Well, I'm a project coordinator here at BOEM, working in the Gulf of Maine, and a proud graduate of Bates College. For those of you who are familiar with Maine, I'm happy to be working in this area and getting back to the roots a little bit. So today, in this presentation, we're going to be chatting about what is BOEM? What do we do for those that are not aware? We'll provide an overview of our leasing process, discussing an example and how it applies to the Gulf of Maine, and touch a little bit on some recent fisheries engagement activities and overview of our environmental studies program. So as Jim mentioned, we are the federal agency that is the lead for offshore wind, and our authority comes from the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And that act does many things, among which names the Outer Continental Shelf as a vital national resource that we should steward for expeditious and orderly development subject to environmental safeguards. And that act was generally published aimed at oil and gas activities until 2005, when the Energy Policy Act came around, added a clause that allowed give jurisdiction for energy from sources other than oil and gas, and that is where renewables come in. And so we work as the lead federal agency, but with many other federal agencies and states, such as yourselves, in the process. And we are located across the United States. So in Alaska, our activities are primarily focused on oil and gas. In the Pacific, some of the first oil and gas activities now pursuing more active renewables. Gulf of Mexico is just starting their renewables activities, but mostly focusing on oil and gas structures there, and of course on the Atlantic. So since, as Jim mentioned, this program started, we've been pretty busy. There's a lot that's going on. You can see this map here shows the West Coast and the East Coast. Most of the activity has been happening on the East Coast, and we've completed 8 commercial lease sales. And you can see there that there are 18 active leases as a result of that. 2 of them have been issued as research leases. And as we'll discuss, there are some milestones in our process, the first of which is a site assessment plan. And we have approved 14 of those documents. The next is a general activities plan, or that's really for a research lease, but one of those has been approved. But really what you hear people talk about a lot is a construction operation plan, or a COP. And that is really where the rubber hits the road, and where a developer has looked at their site, they've done the studies and said this is proposing what they'd like to do. And we have approved 2 of those last year, currently reviewing 12 of those documents, and anticipate another 5 within the next 12 months. We've issued 11 guidance documents to help guide our interpretation of our regulations. And importantly for this consideration, or this call, looking at 7 different areas in the OCS for additional leasing activities, of course, the Gulf of Maine being one of them. And the significant milestone we can't forget to mention is the steel on the water in federal waters that is first occurred in 2020 offshore Virginia. So if you haven't seen this graphic before, welcome. This is the rainbow graphic, as we call it, that depicts our process in a very simplified manner. And it really outlines 4 main phases: planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, and construction and operations. And we'll focus most of our activities today on the planning and analysis and leasing side of things. But it is important to note that after the leasing does occur, there's a lessee that's on board. They conduct a series of studies to inform their site assessment activities. Eventually, they submit a construction operations plan. And once that project is installed, much of the compliance activities and the regulations get transferred to our sister agency, BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. And they're the ones that ensure the project is operating in a manner consistent with all applicable laws, and that is also decommissioned at the end of the process, end of the lease life. But today we're talking about the beginning. So, and this is really where we're at with the Gulf of Maine. And this is illustrative again of the overall process leading up to an auction. And it starts either at a request for interest or a call for information nominations. And when I say start, I mean that's sort of where the official document gets published, but what it really starts at is conversations like these. Officially, it's a governor or someone asking us to start, but it's coming from the states, folks interested in pursuing offshore wind, and they ask us to engage. But essentially, as I'll depict in a minute, areas are identified on the Outer Continental Shelf. We issue those areas or identify those areas in a Federal Register notice and hold a comment period associated with it, at which point the public can submit comments responding to the questions we ask. Typically, during those comment periods or around those comment periods, we'll have task force meetings. And these task forces, a lot of the members on this call are part of, but are really integral to our process. And through the request for interest and the call for information and nominations, we will identify and deconflict it down to wind energy areas. And those wind energy areas are a key step in our process. And when you branch from there are 2 parallel processes that happen. The first is an environmental assessment, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but also the leasing document development. So a proposed sale notice and a final sale notice are published in that time period, along with a public comment period and likely another task force meeting associated with the proposed sale notice. And all that ends up with an auction at the end of that process. So graphically, a request for interest again is an area primarily, and it's an optional step in our regulations. And it's an area that is identified that we put out there and ask for information. Not only information about the site itself, but also the level of interest from developers in actually developing that area to ensure that it's actually suitable for wind development. Once we have the information collected from that request for interest, we'll use that information to narrow things down as applicable. So that we might receive some information that certain areas are not really ripe for development at this point, and that'll be narrowed down. That's why the call area is smaller, the box here is smaller. And it's asking again for specific information, but also for nominations from developers. So a developer comes in and says, I would like to develop here. Here's the spot that I would like to develop, and here's why. Again, informing our process to try and find the best spot to deconflict. It's also an opportunity for folks that see a potential issue with or a lack of ability to coexist to present that information to BOEM for our consideration. And all that information comes together and it culminates in the identification of a wind energy area. And this is significant because it's the part of the Outer Continental Shelf that we do our NEPA analysis on. So our National Environmental Policy Act environmental assessment. And it's also the basis for the areas we eventually offer for lease. In the past, we've identified a wind energy area, and then that area itself has become the lease area that we offer. But it's also possible for us to offer subsections of that as depicted here for sale. As I mentioned, the environmental assessment is a key part of our process, and it looks at two things, or I'll highlight two things. One is site characterization activities. So what is the baseline, what is out there? Series of surveys, biological, geological, geotechnical, archaeological surveys, and as well as site assessment activities. And what are the impacts of those site assessment activities? Typically, we see buoy deployments. They also could include a meteorological tower. So here we have an example of a buoy and a Met tower, as well as some of the surveys that could occur on the leasehold. The proposed sale notice, I often say I really like these names because they do, the titles of the documents, they say exactly what they do. It is proposing an area that we may sell, and it highlights those areas themselves, highlights the lease areas, highlights the fiscal terms associated with them, the way and manner in which we will auction it, the lease terms for the lease itself. And it's also the last opportunity for a company to come in and say, I would like to bid and play in this space and submit the necessary technical, legal, and financial information to do so. The final sale notice is what it is. It's the final lease areas we're offering, the terms associated with it. It highlights a number of things, including the bid deposits that are required for bidders to participate in an auction. It'll list the list of qualified bidders that have qualified. We'll hold a mock auction, and then finally an auction to auction off those areas themselves. So very quickly, I'm going to go through an example of what that means on a map. You got a sense of what it is in the abstracts, and for those that are a little bit more concrete, we'll nail this down. And so you're aware, this is the New York Bight area, and over here we have the New Jersey coast, the New York, Long Island here. This is the existing lease areas at the time we started off New Jersey, New York, and southern New England. The state of New York and NYSERDA came to us and said, we've got some pretty lofty goals for offshore wind. We think we need some more acreage to fulfill them. Here are some areas you should start looking. And those are the areas within those green boxes. And so we looked at them and said, well, what's going out on the ocean now? What's happening now? And there's a lot. The New York Bight itself is a pretty busy place, but this is just a sense of some of the factors that we consider when thinking about a call for information and nominations. So there's navigation. What are the areas that people navigate or required to navigate in through traffic separation schemes? Where may they navigate in the future? Water depth considerations. Here we're talking about fixed bottom technology. So if you get too deep, it becomes uneconomical. Department of Defense activities, fisheries activities. In this case, there is a buffer from the coastline to account for several things. Fisheries and fishing activities, marine biodiversity, visual impacts, and fairways as well. Again, accounting for vessel traffic. So all those things were accounted for and resulted in a call for information nominations, again, in that blue area. So the areas within that blue area. And that was about 1.7 million acres. And that was in April of 2018. We took that information and refined it and presented it to our task force as a draft wind energy area in November. So how did we get from the call to the draft? Well, there's a lot to consider. And here's just a subset of them. So I said there's nominations, right? So people came in and said, here are the areas that we think would be best to develop. This is a heat map. So the areas that are in red are areas where 5 individual developers came together and said, these are areas that we think would be suitable for development. Fishing activities. This is very important, especially in the New York Bight, and this is one of many maps we developed called a relative use index that looks at not only the value of the fishery, but also where fishing vessels are and where they transit and fish. So another heat map here, you see areas in red, more used relative to areas of the cooler blue colors, which are less used. Vessel traffic as a whole, the New York Bight's a very busy area, but you can see that most of them do apply to or obey by the rules of the road. There's some very clear traffic patterns along the coastline through the traffic separation schemes, and maybe less so when you get further out to shore and some of this fishing activity. And not only do we look at things that happened in the past or are happening now, but also how will this area be used in the future? And this is an example of a proposed U.S. Coast Guard fairway as part of their port access route study process, something we've been working with them for many years on, as well as the Department of Defense. So here's an example of the areas in red. They said these areas probably would be problematic for offshore wind development. We worked with them through the process, got them to winnow that down a little bit. So really it's just the area here that they would like to have excluded through the process. And that's the important part, is that everybody is working together to understand what the concerns are, understand what the conflicts are, and mitigate where possible. And so that ended up with final wind energy areas in March of 2021. You can see that we did make some changes. The areas in hatching here are areas that were draft, but not final. And these wind energy areas went forward as part of our process. And you'll see that there's a 53% reduction from the acres identified in the call to those that were wind energy areas. Shortly after that, we issued a proposed sale notice, and that proposed sale notice didn't include all the wind energy areas, right? So it didn't include fairways south and fairways north, highlighted these down here, and divided them up into lease areas. That was a further reduction from the call. And then finally, we ended up, based on the comments we received in response to the proposed sale notice, with final lease areas. And these final lease areas represented a 72% reduction from the call area itself. And these are the final lease areas that will be offered for sale on February 23rd in a couple of weeks. And so the New York Bight lease also comes with some innovative lease stipulations, some of which I'll highlight and describe today, just to give you a sense of how BOEM is continually improving our process. These stipulations revolved enhanced engagement, communication plans, coordinated engagement efforts, and efforts to plan transmission as early as possible, project labor agreements, and domestic supply chain. So this graphic is depicting the new enhanced engagement lease stipulation, and it takes the form of a semi-annual, just every 6 months, progress report. And this is cyclical and continuous process that emphasizes early and regular meaningful engagement, and that's really key. It begins at lease issuance and extends through the approval of the construction and operation plan. And as you can see here, there's 4 main phases, right? Engage, report, feedback, and refine. And integral to the process are the themes of accountability and transparency, which is why they're in the middle of that graphic. And it's important to note an example of our process here is that we created this new lease stipulation and reporting requirements in response directly to comments we received, particularly from the fishing community, that previous engagement in other places with developers has felt more like a check the box exercise, that folks weren't consulted early enough, and that it was unclear how, if at all, information that was provided was used to inform or change the project. And this process is designed to improve that meaningful engagement. And I want to clarify that this is a process that's particularly for the lessees because it's part of the leases themselves. And BOEM is also working on our internal engagement processes as well. We also have a new lease stipulation for project labor agreements, and that is that every lessee must make a reasonable effort to enter into a PLA covering the construction stage of any proposed project in the lease area. We also recognize the tipping point we are at with regard to supply chain, and so require an establishment of a statement of goals that really describes how the lessee plans to contribute to the creation of a robust and resilient US-based supply chain. And if they're able to do so and demonstrate that as part of their project, they'll be potentially eligible for incentives and operating fee credit as part of that process. So that's a lot of talk about the Gulf of Maine, but about New York Bight, but it doesn't really apply to the Gulf of Maine. Excuse me, it all applies to the Gulf of Maine, but what does it mean for the Gulf of Maine is what I'm trying to say. And so here for the commercial leasing process. So as you're aware, or likely aware, the Secretary announced BOEM's leasing roadmap from 2021 and 2025, and it set a target of holding a lease sale for the Gulf of Maine in 2024. And so we're following up on that December 2019 task force meeting. And as mentioned earlier, plan to reconvene that task force meeting for the spring. And in that same context, BOEM also received the Maine research array application. And so that was in October of last year for a floating array in federal waters. That's about 25 miles offshore, up to 144 megawatts or 12 turbines, and about 16 square miles of space. And BOEM appreciates that application, and we're currently reviewing and processing that. We also wanted to provide a little bit of an update on some of the current activities regarding phishing mitigation guidance development. And so this is another RFI, but instead of a request for interest, a request for information that was released and published in November of 2021. And this document was really designed to gather information to inform BOEM's development of a draft guidance document. And that guidance document is aimed at avoiding, minimizing, and if needed, compensating those that may be impacted from offshore wind energy development. And we're currently in the process of taking all that feedback we received and digesting it. And just to highlight some of the topic areas that were included in that request for information. Really, first a general approach, right? How do you approach this from the start? What considerations should be taken into account for project siting, design, navigation, and access? What safety measures are necessary? Environmental monitoring plans, and lastly, financial compensation. As I said, this started last fall, or fall/winter 2021. We identified ideas and considerations from the fishing community, offshore wind developers, and others to inform that draft guidance. This early winter, we are ongoing right now, developing that draft guidance, considering the comments we received, also working with our federal partners, specifically NOAA, NIMS, state fishery and coastal management agencies, and technical experts on that draft guidance itself. And we plan to publish draft guidance and discuss that draft guidance with constituents in the spring. And based on what we hear there, we'll be issuing that final guidance and concluding the process in the summer of 2022. And for those that have desire to get some more information on this topic, we have a website there. You can also reach out to us directly. So that is all for me. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Mary Boatman, who's going to discuss a little bit more about our environmental studies.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mary Boatman, and I'm the science coordinator in the Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and I coordinate our science activities along the Atlantic in support of the program. And I wanted to just introduce you to, we have an environmental studies program that is mandated under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. We've done extensive studies along all the coasts since 1974. And what we do is we fund and manage scientific research to inform all of our decision-making. And we do this by funding through contracts to the private sector, through cooperative agreements with states and with universities, and through interagency agreements with people like NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, reaching out and making sure we get the best scientists to address the important questions that we need answered. We do a lot of partnering with other federal agencies, as you can see, again, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense in doing all of our studies and taking advantage of what they know and what they learn and what their questions are. And thus far, we've invested about $80 million into Atlantic renewable energy studies. If you go to the BOEM website, drop-down box renewable energy, you'll see studies. You click on that, and then you can learn more about the things we have ongoing, as well as all the studies that we've completed. Next slide. Luke. And as you know, the Gulf of Maine studies, you communicated to us about some of your concerns. And I just wanted to bring together some of our portfolio in the Gulf of Maine. We do have an ongoing study with the Gulf of Maine, the University of Maine, looking at the zooplankton ecology. And as you know, that's very important. It's a food source for the North Atlantic right whale. We also work with NOAA. We have the Atlantic Marine Assessment Program for Protected Species that's been going on since about 2010, that collects information about the distribution and abundance of cetaceans or whales and turtles all along the Atlantic. So we understand who's out there, what they're doing, where they are, and we can understand how we could be impacting them. We currently have in our procurement process, the ecological baseline studies of the Outer Continental Shelf in the Gulf of Maine. So we'll be going out there and doing probably aerial surveys and collecting information about, again, more detailed information about the species in the Gulf of Maine, what their distribution is, focusing on areas for potential leasing. We also have in our plans, when we do an annual planning process, a study about collecting the comprehensive assessment of existing Gulf of Maine data that, again, is approved for funding. All of these things, of course, are always reliant on the federal budget being passed, but if we have the funding, we move forward. And then within our planning process, you brought to our attention that you'd like to see more about the physical habitat and invertebrates. We've done this in the past. So we have a modified one for the Gulf of Maine, looking at the important habitats in the area. And that would include not just the seafloor, but the fish, the water column, et cetera, everything that composes a habitat, as well as it's so important to understand the socioeconomic impacts of fisheries, in particular the Gulf of Maine and lobster fishery. We know how important that is. So we'll be pursuing doing something like that hopefully next year. And then we also have a study on our books about looking at baseline tourism and recreation, because how important that is as an economic driver along the coasts. And we've got some ideas, what we've learned from Block Island, about how to go out there, establish that baseline. And then we're always open. Again, this is just our beginning portfolio for what we may be looking at in the Gulf of Maine. We're always open to hearing other study ideas. And then Luke, next slide. And then finally, we had just signed a memorandum of understanding between BOEM and NOAA. This was signed by Director Lefton and then Undersecretary Spinrad, excuse me, on January 12th. And this is the commitment for NOAA and BOEM to work together towards the goal of developing 30 gigawatts of wind energy by 2030. It outlines 11 different areas for us to be working together, particularly collaboration when it comes to science and data sharing, as well as streamlining our processes. And I have the website here if you want to read it in detail. Now, this is an umbrella agreement. There'll be additional, more specific agreements that are underway and being developed. And with that, that's the end of our presentation, and we want to open it up to your questions. I already saw there were a few in the chat. So I'll turn it back over, Luke, and everybody for questions. And thank you.
Great. So thanks, Mary. Thanks, Luke. So yes, this is an opportunity for folks here to ask some questions. And what we'll do is we'll do some questions here verbally. There was a few things in the chat. There's also a Q&A open that participants can use, and I can read off some of those as we go. There was just quickly in the chat, Luke, you saw some questions in New York Bite about what is the distance from shore for those lease areas?
Let me just get out of the screen here. There we go. So I can direct you where to look for that. It's
Great.
not a one-word answer, but it's on our website here, and then I'll put the link in the chat.
Great.
But it's they're far enough offshore where there's limited visual concerns, but I will if you scroll down in the link I'm about to post, you'll find the answer.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. And I noticed on your slides, there were some, distances at the bottom there. Great. I see Dan Burgess has his hand up. Dan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, BOEM team, for the presentation. Really helpful. Maybe just to that last question, Luke, expectations, those are going to be fixed bottom, right? Okay.
Correct.
This group spent a lot, our members are spending a lot of time thinking about floating. And then, is it public how many companies are interested in the New York bite? Is that, or is that? It is.
So public. That's also on our website as well. If you click on the final sale notice itself, which I'll put a link in as well, there's 25 companies that have qualified to participate in the sale. And we're in the process right now of receiving bid deposits and bidders financial forms. So you have 25 companies that have qualified, but what it really matters is the companies that come in and put down the $5 million bid deposit to participate.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay. So the way we're going to handle the Q&As, we'll initially take from advisory committee members and members of the Maine members from the Intergovernmental Task Force. I'll also can read off some Q&A, and then if we have some time, I'll take some hands from folks who are attending. So let's start with folks here who are members of the advisory committee and members of the Intergovernmental Task Force. Clarifying questions you might have for BOEM about how all the work we're doing here in Maine and you are doing here in Maine might link up to this process that they're describing today. Terry, Alexander, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. So we get this question a lot in our AP, and I don't know if BOEM can answer it or not. So what happens if we do all this research and this science and we decide that these things aren't worth doing? So we got this research array, we're going to put it out there, and all of a sudden we find out they're doing more damage than good to the environment. What happens then? Is there a process that, have you guys thought that far ahead, or?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a good one. And I think we hope that our process is designed in such a way that we cite and approve a project to a point where we won't be in that situation. But if in fact we do, there are several stipulations that would allow us to go in and halt operations if they're not applying to our lease terms or not applying to any conditions of other approvals they may have. So that is definitely a process that we have available to us.
Can I follow up on that, David?
Yeah, absolutely, Terry.
Yeah. So if that does happen and you get uproar from all its constituents, who are you guys accountable to? I mean, who do you speak to? Who's your boss, and who makes that final decision? I guess because I don't know who BOEM is accountable to. Are you accountable to the Interior Secretary, or who is that?
Correct. Yeah, we are part of the Department of the Interior. That's
Yeah.
Right. And it's important to note too that while there are certainly some very unique characteristics of the Gulf of Maine itself, and it's something we're definitely going to be investing resources into studying, the wind turbines themselves are not entirely unique. There are several thousand that are currently operating successfully in the European sector, as well as other places around the world. So it's something that we also look to that information to ensure we're using the best available science to inform our decisions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Wing, go ahead, please.
Yes, Luke, thanks so much for the presentation. It's really helpful. I had a question on how you use environmental and wildlife data as you go through that wind call area process, and maybe using that example in New York where there's some substantial baseline data available through the digital aerial surveys, and how might that data have been used as you refine those areas?
I can start, maybe Mary can jump in as well. That is a really key part of the process, and there are some things that we're able to identify through those surveys to eliminate areas for consideration. So for example, in the New York Bight, there's considerable more activity in the intercoastal areas. And oftentimes you'll see that we won't necessarily find one attribute, and that one attribute is the reason why something will be removed or changed, right? It's multifactorial in most cases. So that is a big part of it. There are often times where some of the information received regarding avian and biological surveys could be things that are mitigated, and a project can be designed around them. And if that's the case, then maybe leasing activities move forward with that, and it's addressed at the lease stage or the construction stage. But that baseline of information is really the tools that we start with in the planning process.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Representative Hepler, I see your hand up.
Hi, thank you. I was kind of building on what Dan Burgess had asked about and acknowledging that the work you've done in the New York Bight is fixed bottom. Where are you in terms of different methods for assessing the floating wind turbines? And I was thinking of the environmental assessment, which was just mentioned, and also sort of the fisheries physical habitat.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're really asking, how are we incorporating the different foundation technology into our process? Okay, yeah, I think at this stage in the process, it's something we're looking to gather more information on. As you know, that there is no existing floating technology that is deployed in the United States. There certainly are throughout the world. You can look to that, but that's something that we'd be asking for information with the request for information. But certainly looking to this group to help inform that, particularly some of the expertise at Maine and others that have been working on this for quite some time. Any others want to jump in there from Bo?
Yeah,
It's a really good question. Go ahead, Mary.
yeah, Luke, I would just put in the chat. I hope it just goes to panelists. I think maybe it goes out, if you could put it out to everybody. We do have one study we recently completed about floating offshore wind that does, an initial assessment of the different engineering types, as well as some of the environmental concerns to be raised and to be studied. And so I'd recommend, again, going to our website, Renewable Energy drop-down studies. It's under completed studies, physical environment. And again, I put it in, but I think it just went to the hosts and panelists. So perhaps the hosts can share that out with everybody. So it's a starting point for understanding and certainly addressing these questions as we move through the process.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Lucas.
But I'd just like to highlight that point.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just wanted to highlight that point. It's a good one in that, we do not know all the answers to everything in the beginning of the process, and that's why the process exists. And so getting that information and asking for it is really part of it. And I appreciate you engaging this early in the process to help us gather information to make the best decision possible.
Great. So I'll take advantage of just reading a couple questions off, and then I'll jump over to Abib real quick. One of the questions was from an observer saying, are these new lease stipulations that you described for the New York Bight being used on all BOEM areas or only New York?
So those lease stipulations that I described are only applicable to the new leases we'll be offering at February 23rd. The mechanism we have to require them is the lease itself. So once the lease is offered, we can't change that. So it's not retrospective.
Okay, and I'm not quite sure if the question is about retrospective or prospective, but I think if there's anything else you want to say about sort of prospectively looking forward about those types of lease stipulations.
I guess I'd say that we put a lot of thought into them and a lot of work went into crafting them. And so we're excited to see how they get rolled out, and should they be successful, I think there's interest in continuing those types of things in other areas.
Super. Thanks, Luke. Habib, go ahead, please.
Hi, Luke. Thank you for a great presentation today, and it's good to see you again. You said that the goal is to have some lease sales on the Gulf of Maine in 2024. At the same time, you showed a list of studies that you'd like to conduct in the Gulf of Maine to collect data to allow you to do a lease sale. Do you think you'll have all these studies done on time and the results come in to have a lease sale in 2024?
Mary, could you comment on the timing there?
Sure. So well, first of all, with our science, we're always continually collecting information. It not only informs our leasing, but it informs construction operations, the location of everything. We'll have some baseline information. As you well know, the Gulf of Maine is reasonably well studied. There are still some questions. We'll have some data. We probably won't have absolutely everything you want, but as we gather it, we always incorporate it. And then we're also looking through the task forces and everything for you to share data with us. And that's part of the whole process.
Thank you. Is there a time where you might determine that we literally don't have enough data to do a lease sale in 24?
Sorry, Habib, can you just repeat that? You said, is there a time in the process?
Is there a time at which point you say, I have all the data I need as BOEM to have a good lease sale? Is there a time when you make that decision? Do I have enough data to make a lease sale and identify it's on WEAs or not?
Yeah, I think the time is when the final sale notice is issued. That's the determination that we've received enough information to hold a sale.
Okay,
But
thank you.
Thanks. Senator Jackson, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm curious, I mean, what does NOAA say about the impact of building these, the construction, the use on the right whales? Or are they saying anything?
yeah, thank you, Senator Jackson. That's a great question. Mary, do you have any? You want to mention the study that's ongoing about the mooring lines?
Oh, for one, yes, we have a study out in California because we're concerned about mooring lines and the interactions of whales. We're doing some modeling with respect to that. We also, as you know, we do consultations with NOAA's a partner through the whole process in providing us with baseline information in the beginning, in their role in consultations under the Endangered Species Act. So they're part of evaluating the projects, determining mitigation measures to reduce it. So they're right there with us and understanding and studying and looking at the turbine development. So they'll be with us on this process as well. In terms of, and so they're, and again, asking questions and helping drive the science too.
And I just highlight the importance of our intergovernmental task forces, of which NOAA and NIMS are a very active member. And I'm looking forward to hosting that meeting this spring to continue that conversation.
Thanks. Senator Jackson, any follow-up on that? Or any other question?
No, I think I appreciate that answer. I'm having a hard time to understand how they make decisions here in Maine, but without knowing more, but that's fine. I appreciate that answer.
Great.
I might just tack on real quickly to what Luke said there. You know, along with the task force meetings, you know, Luke walked through the leasing, the planning and leasing process that we have and the different stages within that. And both through the task force and as well as when there are those public comment periods, NOAA will often provide very informative comments, and they'll make suggestions on, you know, the best available data that should be used, considerations about habitat and interactions with protected species, and they'll make recommendations for our consideration and incorporation into the process. And that'll happen, you know, from that the earliest stages of that planning and leasing process, right through to the comment period on the proposed sale notice before any sort of final sale notice would be offered. So there are federal partners, and like Luke said, very involved throughout in representing the resources that they manage and providing us the best available information.
Thanks, Zach. I'll take advantage to read off a couple of questions that have come in from folks who are observing this meeting today. We have a couple around environmental assessments, and one that says, could you clarify at what stage environmental assessments are done? For example, are the ecological baseline studies taking place in areas that have already been designated as lease areas? And a related question is about what is the difference between the environmental assessment for offshore wind in the planning phase versus the EIS that is common in oil and gas leasing for every 5-year program in specific lease area? So Luke or someone else, could you clarify a little bit at the timing and the nature of those environmental assessments?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I'm just going to share my screen again and bring up one of the slides we had discussed. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, it's good.
All right. So this is where the environmental assessment process is. And again, we're in the beginning of the process here. So environmental assessment happens about here. And that environmental assessment is looking at site characterization and site assessment activities. It is not looking at the full build out of the facility. In the full build out of the facility and the environmental impact statement, that study occurs at this point in the process once BOEM has received a complete and sufficient construction and operation plan. And that way we know exactly what's being proposed. So that way we're able to develop alternatives in the EIS itself that's specific to the project that's out there. Mary, did you want to add to that as well from your perspective in environmental branch?
I think you explained it very well. And I want you to, the other aspect of it is that through the EIS process, we make the decision to approve with modifications, or disapprove the project. So right up until the record of decision is issued, we could deny the project because we determine the environmental consequences are just too great. So the process isn't done until that point.
Thanks, Mary. I'll take one more question that folks have put in from observers, and it is, how does BOEM account for the unknown, in quotes, future value of fisheries when valuing a lease area?
Thank you for that question. That's a good one. I think you're getting at, again, it's not just the past, it's not what we're doing right now, but what's happening in the future. And that's a tricky question, and something that we think about a lot. A lot of that has to do with trying to understand what's happening in the ocean now, but also what may happening in the future. We're seeing trends of changing water temperatures, which may change the abundance and distribution of species, which then may have an effect on the actual fisheries landings themselves. Is something we consider. And also try and understand that if there is an impact, where is that impact going to be? And this is all part of the environmental impact statement process. But if there's an impact to a particular industry, for example, is that serving one? Is that where is that impact distributed to? Is it one individual community? Is it a larger area? And all those are considered as part of environmental impact statement in our process, and what the decision maker goes through when, as Mary said, reviewing that project, approving modifications, or rejecting the project, or disapproving is a better word.
Great.
And I'll just add to Luke's response there that, in addition to relying on our own science and our studies, many of which Mary has spoken to, and engaging with our kind of partnering state and federal agencies with expertise in fisheries. We also get information such as that from engaging directly with fishermen and engaging, like Luke explained, as part of the new stipulation for the New York bite, but this really emphasis to engage early and often, and especially with fishermen, and trying to use, the wealth of information that they have from their day-to-day use of the ocean, and the trends that they're seeing. And, there are both informal and formal opportunities throughout the planning and leasing process for BOEM to solicit that information and work with fishermen to incorporate that into our planning process.
Thanks, Zach.
And it's actually, just to elaborate that a little bit further, there's actually a good example there. So we have done studies to model the effects of potential offshore wind development in the surf clam industry. And that's something that we did in the New York bite to examine how potential impacts or how potential development could displace or move surf clam fishing activity. And that was something that was incorporated as part of our decision-making process.
Okay. So I've got one more question in the chat I'll throw out there for you all. It's around construction and related to the construction of the turbines onshore and also the erection of the equipment out in the designated lease areas. Has BOEM considered construction compliance and enforcement? And there's a continuation of that, saying that feels to be lacking to date.
Absolutely. And that's a huge part of our process that we gather information on. But BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, that's really where their portion of the regulations lie. So we certainly consider it, but compliance enforcement is something that is handled by that agency.
Can you spell out that acronym for folks who don't know that organization?
Sorry, it's the Bureau for Safety and Environmental Enforcement.
Got it. Thank you. Great. Okay, last call on questions from advisory committee members or folks who are on the Maine task force. Anything else about how the work in Maine will sync up to this work that BOEM's describing today? Last call for questions there. Okay, great. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for an informative hour. I really appreciate, we all appreciate folks who can invest time to help us learn as this process moves forward. I'll turn it back to you, Dan, or before I do actually, Luke or Zach or Mary, any last thing you'd like to say before we wind this up?
I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to explain our process and get everybody on the same page for baseline information. And as Jim said in the beginning, this really works when everybody works together to share information and allow us to really make the best decision that we can with the most available up-to-date information. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Luke. Okay, Dan?
Yeah, I want to again thank the team from BOEM for joining us for the last hour. Really informative, thoughtful discussion. Appreciate it. Appreciate all the participants that have joined, not just the roadmap and the task force groups, but also quite a few people just watching and participating through the webinar. But really, I think the work that is happening in Maine or has been happening in Maine will really set us up well to engage in the process. And just this coordination and communication with BOEM is really a big part of that. So thank you to the BOEM team. And I think, Admiral, if you have any closing words, I think we're
just echo your thanks. And this was very informative, and it will certainly inform our work as we go forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. We'll end it here. The recording will be on the website, as will the slides. Have a great afternoon, folks. Take care. All the best.
Thank you.